There's so much more to game dev than just making the game itself. You've got coding, art, playtesting, marketing, and so much more. You know what really scares people? Legal.
Have you seen this man?
It's the part of game development that most devs don't really think about, usually ignoring everything legal until it's a problem. And by then, it's too late. Like forgetting to file your corporate transparency. Under new law this year, if you don't file correctly, you can pay $500 per day for non-compliance. And in some cases of willful violation, potential criminal penalties like fines up to $10,000 and imprisonment for 2 years. I don't want this to happen to you. I want you to walk away from this video with a clear understanding of what is needed and expected when starting an indie studio. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I have helped hundreds of companies get started, so I know a thing or two about starting your studio correctly. That said, I also brought in an old friend who was a Silicon Valley lawyer, and he has helped thousands of companies get started legally. I can't cover everything legal, of course, in this video, but my hope is that by the end of all this, you'll know how to set up your studio officially, what state to pick when doing so, and kind of all those ins and outs associated. I'll be covering other legal topics like company ownership, growing your team, and intellectual property in future videos. So let's dive in.
Entity, right? One of the main things you guys do is you help people set up their entities. You help people nail down the incorporation phase, whether it's an LLC or C Corp, whatever it may be. Help us understand what should we be knowing about entity and incorporation and all these fun little legal jargon words that we use.
Absolutely. So whenever you're starting out on your journey to, as a game developer or being an entrepreneur in that sense, your first step is that you need to create a legal identity for your new business, and that requires an entity formation. So there's a few steps you need to be thinking about when you're doing an entity formation. The first question is at what point do I actually need an entity formed? A lot of people, there is cost associated with your entity formation, so in some cases it makes sense to delay that as long as possible. I always say there's a few trigger events that if one of these is happening in the near future, you should probably get your legal entity formed. The first one is, hey, if you're going to be interacting with a co-founder and you want to just nail down who owns what percentage of that business, form the business and get it formalized in writing and through good legal documentation who owns what percentage. Because if it's just, hey, handshake deal, once prospects are looking good and money looks like it's going to be, start flowing, then those conversations might change and people will say, well, I know we talked about doing it 60-40, but I want to change it to 70-30 or 50-50 or, whatever. And so those are conversations you don't want to have that change down the road. You want to get that set in stone. So that's one trigger event once you start working with co-founders.
Real quick, I just want to add a thought here since I didn't get to during the interview. Ownership discussions are critical, and any decision made needs to be put into writing immediately. Not to mention, it's important you incorporate so you can legalize those ownership docs, as Dan is saying. However, as someone who has started a studio and knows how long it can take to make a game, incorporating at this stage is not required and can sometimes be a net negative for your company. Many games take years to make, and starting a studio does cost money. There are annual legal fees, tax costs, and time costs. So just because you have a partner or partners does not mean you have to incorporate immediately. It is recommended, but not a requirement. Evaluate your own situation, your capital, and your partners. I will discuss equity more, so equity partnerships, in the next legal video, but I wanted to address this real quick so you guys had a good understanding. Cool. Back to Dan.
Another trigger event is if you're ever going to take money from an investor, you need to have your legal entity formed so that they can get an ownership of the actual entity that they're putting the money towards.
And by investors, Dan is referring to any type of investment. So if you plan on working with a publisher, you will need to incorporate as well, which brings us now to the third reason.
If you are going to be making money from, putting out your product or your game or your app, you need to have your legal entity formed at that point so that when you register with whatever platform you're going to be distributing on, you can register it in the name of your company. That way the revenues go through that company and the ownership of that relationship and the IP is with the entity. So, money starting to flow or starting to actually sell products or distribute products, that's another trigger event where you need your legal entity formed. So that's kind of the first step. When do you need it formed?
So when should you register your business? If you hit one of these 3 triggers. You're working with a co-founder or partners, you're seeking investment or a publisher, you're generating significant revenue. Simply put, you incorporate for security, not just legitimacy. No one cares if you have an entity when you have no money or assets. People only care and sue when there's something they can gain. So a plan today saves a headache for tomorrow. But to plan, you need to know how much it will cost to incorporate. Here are each of those costs laid out. Number 1, $99 for a filing agent. Number 2, $99 for a registered agent, and $295 for that Delaware state fee. It varies drastically. Some states cost less, others cost more. Just depends.
Next question is, what type of entity should you be forming? There's 2 main types of entities. There's corporations and limited liability companies, or LLCs. And there's each of these 2 different classes of entities. They also have different tax treatments that you should be thinking of. So we're going to put off tax treatment discussion for a few minutes. Let's talk about the difference between an LLC and just a corporation. These are entities that you go and file with a state. There's not a federal filing. There's not a U.S. filing that you do. You pick a state and you file either your LLC or your corporation in that state. So which state should you be filing in? Most people will file in the state where the business is located. So that your business residence is going to be the typically easiest thing for you to do. The reason for that is because if you file in a different state, so you often hear about business-friendly states or states that investors like you to incorporate or form your business in. You'll often hear Delaware. Sometimes you hear Nevada or Wyoming. Those states are fine for you to form your entity in, but you have to recognize you'll also have to then file a registration in your local state anyways, so that you're qualified to do business in your residence state. So because you're going to have to do that regardless, if you do go form a Nevada or a Delaware company, you're going to be paying for 2 state filings. And so in many cases, it just makes sense to file where you're located. That said, if you are going to be raising money from investors, many investors prefer a state like Delaware because they're confident in that state's body of law. And so that's really, in my view, the only reason why you would consider a state to file your entity in that is not your local state.
Quick segue. I personally have companies filed in 3 different states. 2 are LLCs and 1 is a C Corp. Personally, as Dan said, I would just file in your home state. Unless you're raising money, you have a specific use case, or your publisher/investor says otherwise. And if you're international, I would just suggest filing in Delaware. But do your own research, do what's best for you.
So we've talked about the state where you would file in. Now, picking between an LLC or a corporation, there's different use cases. Corporations are usually taxed as either an S Corp or a C Corp. They aren't taxed as a partnership. So those tax treatments of a C Corp of a corporation can limit you a little bit. Corporations are ideal for investors. Investors want you to be a C Corp. Corporations are also great for a few other reasons. One is if you are going to have a large team and want to issue equity incentives or stock options to your team members, that's simplest to do in a corporation taxed as a C Corp. Another consideration why you might want to be a corporation or a C Corp is there's a tax treatment called qualified small business stock. It is available to game developers that if you form as a C corporation, if you hold that stock for 5 years before your company gets acquired or you sell your stock, then when you go to sell it, you won't pay capital gains taxes on your share, on the capital gains recognized from your sale of your stock. So that qualified small business stock rule, or Rule 1202, it's a tax rule that only benefits C Corp stockholders. So that's another reason as a founder why you might want to be a C Corp.
Just to quickly simplify what Dan just said, if you are a C Corp, you do get a special tax rule. This means that if you hold onto your company's stock for 5 years and then sell it, you won't have to pay certain taxes on the money you make. In the longer interview, Dan and I do discuss more in depth this rule, as well as another one called 83B. You can check it out using the link below.
Other factors to consider. A C Corp gets double taxed. So we've talked about benefits of a C Corp. Investors like it, easy to issue stock options, and you got the founder stock getting this tax exclusion where you don't have to pay up to 10 million in capital gains on up to 10 million in capital gains. So a lot of tax benefits there. But if your company is going to be making a lot of profit year over year and you want to distribute that profit out to the stockholders, a corporation results in double taxation. So the corporation will pay taxes on the profit that it makes, and then you will pay taxes on whatever it distributes out to you as income or a dividend. So there's double taxation for the C Corp. A lot of high growth companies, game developers included, you're going to be spending a lot of money growing your business, so you won't necessarily have a lot of profit. So it might not be that big of an issue. Most startups don't have profit because they spend everything they make to try and grow, and they spend it on marketing, they spend it on more developers, they spend it on more content, they spend it on V2. You know, there's a lot that you can spend any money that you make towards, so you might not have to worry about this. It is a consideration, and it's really the primary downside of a C Corp.
What Dan just discussed is why companies like Amazon doesn't pay a lot of their corporate taxes. They funnel all of their excess capital into growth, which just means any profit that they would make. They just reinvest it into their future so it doesn't get taxed. So C Corps are great for those aspiring to grow.
An LLC or an S Corp, on the other hand, an LLC can be taxed as a partnership. Both S Corps and LLCs taxed as partnerships have what we call flow-through taxation. This means that any income that you recognize at the entity level, you don't owe entity level taxes on it. So there's only one level of tax. That is the stockholder of the S Corp or the member of the LLC pays their taxes, but it's only one level. So if you are going to be having a very profitable company and you want to make a lot of distributions out to your stockholders or your members, then you can consider either a corporation taxed as an S Corp or an LLC that gets taxed as a partnership or an S Corp. Both of those would give you that favorable tax treatment in the sense of not having to pay double taxation. Neither of those lets you benefit from the qualified small business stock tax exclusion. So there's pros and cons to each of those tax structures.
So if I were to dumb this down just a little bit for the sake of some game developers, the main thing is LLC, S Corp. This is great if you are a small team, maybe a single individual. You basically want to make a game and just take the money from that to pay for your lifestyle.
Passive income, yeah, exactly. It's just going to flow cash into your bank account. LLC, S Corp, both work great for that.
C Corp, though, this is something where you see this growing. You want to bring on more people. This is where you want to create that studio, that game, and then the next game, and then the next game. This is something you see going and growing, and this longevity.
Exactly, and you're thinking in terms of, I want to raise money to be able to grow this thing fast, bring on other developers, and then I want to sell either single games off or sell the entire portfolio at some point in the future. So those are, C Corp might make more sense if that's your game plan.
That's great. Thanks so much. And so entities, pretty straightforward. There seems to be relatively two paths, right? There's some branching within, but mostly you want to pick based off of an LLC or a C Corp and understand your own path. And what if I go down a path? Can I switch?
Great question. So it's not too hard to switch from an LLC to a C Corp. It is harder to change from a C Corp back to a flow-through tax structure like an S Corp or an LLC. So you technically can, but there's going to be tax hurdles that you have to work around. So it's not set in stone when you make a decision, but it is easier to go from one to the other. And so if you're unsure, it's probably better to start as an LLC and then move into S Corp or C Corp later.
What if I live international? I live in Europe, I live in Africa, Australia. What am I supposed to do? Can I incorporate in the US? What are the parameters? How does that
You
how does that look
absolutely
like?
can, and the question I would ask is why would you want to? And the primary reason to incorporate in the U.S. is if you're going to have a bunch of U.S. employees. You know, it's pretty easy to form that entity in the U.S., have them hired in a U.S. entity, and then do all the taxes and the employment stuff through that U.S. entity. So that's one reason why it would make sense, and not a problem for an international founder to form an entity in Delaware, any other state really. You don't have to have a physical presence in that state to do it. You would pay what is called a registered agent, which is basically an address for hire to be your registered address with the state for the purposes of the state filing. And that's like $100 a year that you would pay for a registered agent, and it's totally fine for an international founder to do that. The other reasons why you might want to be a U.S. entity is if you're going to raise money from U.S. investors. Lastly, and I'm not familiar with this. I'm not a game developer. I'm a software developer, but I haven't developed games, and so I don't know if specific game platforms like
Like Steam and
Steam or the Apple Store, if they have additional hurdles for international companies or not. I'm not familiar with that. So that would be the only other reason I could think of where maybe a U.S. entity would make sense, but it might not matter. I don't know.
that's
Totally
great.
fine for an international person to do it. The one tricky thing is U.S. tax ID number is easier to get if you have a U.S. individual that has an existing social security number or tax ID number in the U.S. to be able to be listed as your tax contact person in the U.S.
So you should now know why to set up an entity, when to do it, and what type you should pick. We can't answer every possible entity question in this video, but this should cover 95% of them. If you have more questions that are legal or entity related, come join our Discord. We did a legal Q&A with Dan a few months ago. We can do it again. Also, go check out the Going Indie Game Kit. It's still in its early stages, but we did build out a custom experience for game developers with Dan, which includes discounted entity filing, equity docs, and more specifically, helping you file that corporate transparency correctly so you don't have to deal with a $500 daily fine. Also, look for 3 more legal videos coming soon. Dan and I will be covering equity next, which is especially relevant if you have co-founders, followed by team building and then intellectual property. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next time. Peace.